15 minutes before my wedding, I received a text message that was meant to completely destroy me. My father wrote that he would rather die than walk me down the aisle to a man he considered street trash. My mother immediately chimed in, declaring I was an absolute embarrassment to our family name. I did not shed a single tear. I just smiled, locked the door to the bridal suite, and sent one final text to a secret contact. When those church doors finally opened, the man holding my arm made my parents' jaws drop and single-handedly destroyed their perfect high society facade. Before I tell you how I turned my wedding day into the ultimate payback, let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button if you have ever had to build your own table because your family refused to give you a seat at theirs. The bridal suite at the cathedral smelled heavily of imported white roses and expensive hairspray. The steady hum of the air conditioning was the only sound in the room as I sat perfectly still in front of the gilded vanity mirror. I let the heavy silk of my custom gown settle around my legs. My hands rested quietly in my lap. I am 32 years old, the founder and chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar chain of luxury dental clinics across Atlanta. Yet in that exact moment I was just a daughter waiting for her father to come and knock on the door. My phone vibrated violently against the marble countertop, shattering the quiet atmosphere. I reached for it, expecting a sweet, nervous message from Jamal, my brilliant and incredibly handsome groom, telling me he could not wait to see me at the altar. Instead, the screen illuminated with a message from Marcus Jackson, my father. I picked up the device, my manicured fingers gripping the edges tightly. The text read, "I am not walking you down the aisle. I refuse to stand in front of our entire congregation and pretend to support this absolute joke of a marriage. You are throwing your life away on a man from the slums, and I refuse to let the Jackson family name be dragged through the mud." Before the shock of his sheer cruelty could even fully register in my brain, a second notification popped up on the screen. This one was from Valerie, my mother. She wrote, "Your father is exactly right, Nia. You are a complete embarrassment today. Chloe is in the restroom sobbing her eyes out because the bridesmaid dress you forced her to wear is utterly humiliating for someone of her social standing. Your father and I are sitting in the very back row. Do not expect us in any family portraits, and do not look for us at the altar." I stood there staring at the glowing screen as the vicious words burned into my mind. 15 minutes. They had deliberately waited until exactly 15 minutes before I was supposed to walk down the aisle to pull the rug out from under me. This was a highly calculated strike. They wanted me to panic. They wanted me to ruin my makeup with tears, to run down the halls of the church sobbing, and to beg them on my hands and knees for their presence and their approval. That was the dynamic they thrived on. In their world, image was the only religion that mattered. My father was a prominent Atlanta cosmetic surgeon whose practice was secretly clinging to relevance, and my mother was a woman who treated her country club status like a royal decree. They despised Jamal. Jamal was a self-made tech entrepreneur who had fought his way out of the roughest neighborhoods in the city to build his own software company. He was kind, generous, and loved me fiercely. But because he did not have a political pedigree, a trust fund, or membership to the right golf clubs, my parents considered him unworthy. And then there was Chloe. My 29-year-old sister was the undisputed golden child of the house. She was a medical resident who was engaged to Liam. Liam was a white man born into a long line of powerful Georgia politicians. In my parents' eyes, Liam was the ultimate prize. He was their golden ticket to generational wealth and untouchable social status. Chloe could do absolutely no wrong, even if she decided to throw a massive temper tantrum over a custom designer dress on her own sister's wedding day. The heavy oak door of the bridal suite suddenly slammed open, hitting the wall with a loud, aggressive crack. My best friend and the general manager of my clinics, Keisha, marched into the room. She was practically shaking with rage. She threw her beautiful bouquet of white orchids onto the velvet sofa and locked eyes with me through the vanity mirror. "I just saw your parents marching to the back of the sanctuary, like they are attending a funeral," Keisha said, her voice a sharp, furious whisper. "Your mother is actually arguing with the ushers right now, loudly refusing to sit in the reserved VIP section. Nia, please tell me they are not doing what I think they are doing." I handed her my phone without saying a single word. Keisha snatched the device from my hand, her eyes darting quickly across the screen as she read the messages from my parents. Her jaw tightened so hard I thought her teeth might crack, and she let out a harsh, bitter laugh that held absolutely no humor. "This is sick," she hissed, pacing the floor of the bridal suite. "This is downright pathological. You paid $80,000 out of your own pocket to save his failing plastic surgery clinic just 3 months ago. When the bank was threatening to lock the doors on his precious medical center, he did not call his fancy politician's son-in-law. He called you. You bailed him out so he could keep playing the wealthy, untouchable doctor at his charity galas. And he has the audacity to call Jamal a joke. He calls you an embarrassment when your dental empire is the only thing keeping a roof over their heads." Every word Keisha spoke hit the exact spot in my chest that had been aching for years. She was entirely right. I was the family ATM. I paid for the luxury vacations, I handled the financial crisis management, and I bought the luxury cars they loved to flaunt. But because I chose to build a highly lucrative business in dentistry, instead of becoming a traditional surgeon, like the rest of my family, I was always considered the lesser daughter. My money was perfectly good enough for them to spend, but my profession and my personal choices were constantly belittled. Keisha stopped her pacing and knelt right beside my chair, looking deeply into my eyes. "Are you going to let them do this to you?" she asked, her voice fierce but intensely protective. "Are you going to let them ruin your wedding day because they are too arrogant and blind to see your worth?" For a very brief, fleeting second, the ghost of the little girl I used to be wanted to cry. I wanted to run out into the sanctuary and apologize for things I had not even done, just to have my father hold my hand and walk me toward my future husband. But that little girl had been completely crushed under years of financial exploitation and emotional neglect. The woman sitting in the silk gown today was a survivor, a CEO, and someone who refused to be a victim ever again. I slowly took my phone back from Keisha's hands. I did not shed a tear. I felt nothing but cold, absolute clarity. I opened a highly secured encrypted messaging app on my phone. There was only one contact saved in this specific folder. It was a private number I had been communicating with over the past 2 weeks, preparing meticulously for a moment exactly like this one. My fingers were perfectly steady as I typed a short, decisive message. "They made their move. It is time. Let us begin." I pressed send, locked the screen, and placed the phone carefully into my beaded bridal clutch. I stood up, smoothing out the front of my gown, and turned to face my best friend. "Keisha, I need you to go to that door and lock the deadbolt right now," I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "Do not let the wedding planner inside. Do not let the photographers inside. Nobody enters this room until the choir starts playing the bridal chorus." Keisha stared at me for a moment, before a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. She backed up and slid the heavy brass lock into place with a resounding click. "What is the plan, boss?" she asked softly, clearly sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "My parents think they have backed me into a corner," I replied, picking up my bouquet of white roses. "They think I am going to walk out there completely alone, looking humiliated and rejected in front of 300 of Atlanta's most elite guests. They think they hold all the power today. But they have absolutely no idea who I have been talking to behind closed doors. And when those church doors open, they are going to realize they just made the most catastrophic mistake of their entire lives." The heavy oak doors of the bridal suite were securely locked, but my mind was no longer in that room. I looked away from Keisha and stared at a vintage oil painting hanging on the far wall of the suite. The dark strokes of crimson in the artwork pulled me sharply backward in time. The foundation for my parents' grand betrayal today was not built overnight. It had been meticulously laid exactly 8 months ago at my engagement party. That night was supposed to be the happiest evening of my life, but it quickly turned into a suffocating nightmare. If there had been a camera circling the room, it would have captured the exact moment the air was sucked out of my lungs. Jamal and I had spared no expense. We rented the entire top floor of the Piedmont Country Club, we paid for the extravagant floral arrangements, the string quartet, and the 5-course catered dinner completely out of our own pockets. But if you had walked into that opulent ballroom as a stranger, you would have sworn my parents were the generous benefactors hosting the social event of the season. They glided across the room accepting compliments and acting as if Jamal and I were merely guests at their private gala. I remember standing near the entrance with Jamal holding his hand and smiling warmly at relatives who barely gave him the time of day. We were celebrating our commitment to each other, but the entire atmosphere shifted the second my mother walked through the double doors. Valerie Jackson did not just arrive at events. She made entrances. For her eldest daughter's engagement party, she had chosen to wear a floor-length ivory silk gown featuring a sweetheart neckline and a dramatic train. She was essentially wearing a wedding dress. I heard several of Jamal's family members gasp in disbelief as she swept into the room kissing cheeks and waving to the crowd as if she were the bride. I did not say a word. I just tightened my grip on Jamal's hand and forced a polite smile. I had spent 32 years surviving my mother's desperate need to be the center of attention. My father Marcus was no better. He was holding court near the private bar surrounded by his fellow medical board members and country club golfing buddies. He had a glass of expensive scotch in one hand, and his other hand was firmly clapped onto the shoulder of Bradley Sterling. Bradley was my younger sister Chloe's husband. He came from a long line of white old money Georgia politicians. He wore a seersucker suit and had the kind of easy, entitled laugh that only comes from never having to struggle a single day in your life. My father was practically glowing with pride as he introduced Bradley to his colleagues. He spoke loudly, making sure his voice carried over the soft jazz music. "This is my son-in-law, Bradley." My father boomed, his chest puffed out. "His grandfather is Judge Harrison Sterling. You know the Sterlings. Real pedigree. These are the kind of men who truly elevate our family to the next level." Jamal, the man who had actually written the software architecture for 3 major banking apps and secured his own future, was standing less than 10 feet away. My father did not even glance in his direction. To Marcus Jackson, building your own wealth from nothing was a sign of low-class struggle. Inheriting wealth and a recognizable last name was the only true mark of success. I watched Jamal politely excuse himself to get us some water, masking his discomfort with that quiet dignity I loved so much. My heart ached for him. He was trying so hard to respect my family, completely unaware that my family viewed him as an unfortunate stain on their pristine reputation. Then came my sister Chloe. She glided across the room with Bradley by her side, wearing a designer cocktail dress that she had quietly charged to my corporate credit card just 2 weeks prior. Chloe was 29, effortlessly beautiful, and the undisputed golden child of the Jackson household. She was navigating her medical residency, and in my parents' eyes, she was the only daughter who truly mattered because she had followed the acceptable path. She had the medical degree and she had secured the politician's son. About an hour into the evening, it was time for the toasts. Jamal's best man had just given a beautiful, heartfelt speech about our relationship. The room was warm with applause. That is when my mother decided it was her turn. She signaled the waitstaff to pour champagne and confidently stepped up to the microphone in her ivory gown. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the glass, demanding the absolute attention of every person in the room. "Thank you all for gathering here tonight," my mother began, her voice echoing through the grand hall. "Family is the most important thing in the world to Marcus and me. We have always pushed our daughters to strive for excellence, to uphold the Jackson standard in everything they do." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the crowd before landing directly on Chloe. "And that is why tonight is so incredibly special. Marcus and I are beyond thrilled to officially announce that our youngest daughter, Chloe, has just been accepted into the highly competitive dermatology residency program at Atlanta General Hospital." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a sudden burst of applause from my parents' friends. I stood completely frozen next to Jamal. It was my engagement party. The banner above the entrance literally had my name and Jamal's name written in gold foil. Yet my mother was standing at the front of the room, raising a glass of champagne that I had paid for and turning my celebration into a victory lap for my sister. She continued speaking, her voice dripping with overwhelming pride. "Dermatology is one of the most elite fields in medicine. We always knew Chloe was destined for greatness. She and Bradley are building such a magnificent life together. They truly represent the very best of our family." so please raise your glasses to Dr. Chloe Jackson Sterling and her wonderful husband. May your future be as bright as you both are. She did not mention Jamal. She did not mention my engagement. She did not even say my name. The room eagerly toasted to Chloe, completely oblivious to the sheer cruelty of what had just happened. Or perhaps they were just too polite to call it out. Jamal wrapped his arm around my waist and pulled me close, whispering in my ear that it was okay, and that we did not need her validation. But the humiliation burned hot in my chest. It was a very specific kind of pain, the kind that only your own mother can inflict. The music resumed and the crowd slowly dispersed back to their conversations. I walked over to a quiet corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows, trying to collect myself. I needed a moment to breathe. But peace was never an option when Chloe was around. I heard the click of her heels before I saw her. She approached me holding a large crystal glass filled to the brim with dark red wine. Bradley was trailing a few steps behind her, already looking flushed and slightly unsteady on his feet from taking advantage of the open bar. Chloe stopped right in front of me, looking me up and down with an expression of sheer pity. "Well," she said, taking a slow sip of her wine. "That was quite the speech. I hope you are not too upset, Nia. You know how Mom gets. She is just so excited about my career. Dermatology is incredibly prestigious. Not everyone can handle the rigorous path of real medicine." She put a heavy emphasis on the word real, making sure to insult my dental clinics in the same breath. I looked at my sister, feeling a sudden intense exhaustion. I was tired of the game. I was tired of fighting for a spot on a pedestal I did not even want. "I am not upset, Chloe," I replied evenly. "I am happy for you. I just wish Mom had chosen a different night to make your announcement. This was supposed to be about Jamal and me." Chloe let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Oh, please, Nia. You have to admit that Jamal is not exactly country club material. Mom and Dad are just trying to save face. You cannot honestly expect them to be thrilled about you marrying a guy who grew up on food stamps when I managed to marry into the Sterling family. It is embarrassing for them." Before I could even process the absolute venom in her words, Chloe took a sudden, exaggerated step forward. She stumbled, pretending to trip over the hem of her own dress. With a sharp gasp, she thrust her hand forward, and the entire glass of dark red wine splashed directly onto the bodice of my custom engagement dress. The cold liquid soaked instantly into the delicate white fabric, leaving a massive, dark, jagged stain right across my chest. Several guests nearby gasped and turned to look. Bradley chuckled softly from behind her, not even bothering to hide his amusement. Chloe put a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with fake shock. "Oh my goodness!" she gasped loudly, ensuring everyone around us could hear. "Nia, I am so incredibly sorry. I just lost my footing. But I mean, you are so used to cleaning up messes, I am sure you can figure out how to wash it out yourself, right? It is not like it is designer anyway." She smirked a cruel, satisfied little smile that she thought meant she had won. She thought she had broken me. She expected me to scream, to cry over the ruined dress, to run out of my own party in absolute shame. But I did not react the way she wanted. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the red stain spreading across my chest. I felt a strange, profound sense of calm wash over my entire body. I looked up at Chloe, and then I looked at Bradley, who was leaning against a pillar looking so arrogant and untouchable in his seersucker suit. What Chloe did not know, what my social climbing parents did not know, and what Bradley Sterling was desperately trying to hide from the entire world, was the secret sitting in my email inbox. Just that morning, my private financial investigator had sent me a comprehensive encrypted report on the Sterling family. I had requested the background check because something about Bradley's constant need to borrow my parents' vacation home had felt off to me. The report had revealed everything. The legendary Sterling family fortune was completely gone. Decades of terrible political campaigns, severe gambling addictions, and gross mismanagement had drained their trust funds dry. Bradley was not a wealthy heir. He was a man drowning in millions of dollars of hidden debt. His real estate company was secretly facing bankruptcy, and he was currently under quiet investigation for severe financial fraud. He had married Chloe not because he loved her, but because he thought the Jackson family had enough liquid cash to bail him out. He thought he was marrying into a gold mine, I looked at my sister who was smiling at me like she held the world in the palm of her hand. I looked at the red wine dripping onto the floor. This ruined dress was absolutely nothing compared to the absolute devastation that was coming for her perfect, prestigious life. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply pulled a crisp white napkin from a passing tray and gently dabbed at the wine stain on my chest. "Do not worry about the dress, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice incredibly soft and pleasant. "It is just a minor spill. Some messes are much, much harder to clean up, especially the ones you do not see coming." Chloe frowned, her perfectly arched eyebrows pulling together in confusion. She did not understand what I meant, and I had no intention of explaining it to her. I turned my back on my sister and her fraudulent husband walking calmly through the crowd to find Jamal. The engagement party had been a stolen night, but it was the catalyst for the greatest revenge of my life. I stand up from the velvet sofa in the cathedral bridal suite. My hand is perfectly steady as I pick up a heavy crystal decanter from the hospitality cart. I pour a splash of dark red Cabernet into a glass, watching the rich liquid swirl against the crystal. It looks exactly like the stain my sister intentionally left on my engagement dress 8 months ago. I take a slow, deliberate sip. I am not shaking. I am not crying. I am completely in control. The panic and absolute devastation my parents wanted to induce right before my walk down the aisle is nowhere to be found. Instead, I feel an icy surge of intense anticipation. Keisha watches me from across the room, her eyes wide with respect, standing guard by the locked door and waiting for my next command. But my mind drifts back to the moment I finally stopped playing their foolish games. The moment I realized that trying to win my family's love was a losing battle, and the only way to deal with them was to speak the only language they truly understood and worshipped: money and power. 3 months after that disastrous engagement party, my mother insisted on taking me wedding dress shopping. It was a time-honored tradition, she claimed. A mother's sacred duty to purchase her eldest daughter's bridal gown. I knew better than to trust her sudden burst of maternal generosity. But a tiny foolish part of me hoped she actually wanted to share this milestone with me. We went to the most exclusive bridal boutique in Buckhead. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, plush white carpets lined the floors, and complimentary champagne flowed freely from silver trays. Naturally, she brought Chloe along. I stood on the velvet pedestal in front of a massive three-way mirror, wearing a classic, elegant silk gown with delicate lace sleeves. It cost $3,000. In the world of luxury Atlanta weddings, it was incredibly modest, but I loved it. It was exactly what I had envisioned for my walk down the aisle toward Jamal. My mother sat on a plush white sofa directly behind me, sipping her champagne, completely ignoring my reflection. Her attention was entirely focused on the fitting room door next to my pedestal. The heavy curtain pulled back and Chloe stepped out into the showroom. She was not wearing a bridesmaid dress. She was wearing a breathtaking, heavily beaded floor-length silver evening gown. The bodice was encrusted with thousands of Swarovski crystals that caught the light from every single angle in the room. It was an absolute showstopper. It was also priced at $15,000. My mother gasped in sheer delight, aggressively clapping her hands together. "Oh, Chloe, you look absolutely radiant," she cooed, standing up to admire the intricate beadwork. "That is the one. You absolutely have to wear it." I stepped off my pedestal carefully, holding the heavy silk skirt of my wedding dress so it would not drag on the floor. "Mom," I said quietly, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "What about my dress? We are supposed to be ordering my bridal gown today." My mother turned to look at me, her expression instantly dropping from pure joy to mild, arrogant annoyance. She sighed deeply, waving her hand dismissively at my reflection in the mirror. "Nia, let us be realistic," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet, upscale boutique. "Chloe is currently carrying the senator's first grandchild. She is going to be the guest of honor at the Winter Political Fundraising Gala next month. She absolutely needs this $15,000 gown to represent the Sterling family properly in front of the press." She paused, looking me up and down with blatant distaste, evaluating my simple silk dress. "You can just go to a local department store and find something nice off the rack for yourself. I am sure your little spa manager's salary can cover a ready-made dress." I am not paying $3,000 for a dress you will wear once to marry a man who does not even own a bespoke tuxedo. Chloe turned side to side in the mirror, admiring her own glittering reflection. She patted her perfectly flat stomach, where this supposedly royal political grandchild was growing. Mom is right, Nia, Chloe chimed in, offering me a sickening look of fake sympathy. You have to understand social priorities. Liam's family is expecting me to look like a politician's wealthy wife. Jamal's family will probably just be happy if the buffet food is free. You do not need to try so hard to impress people who do not know the difference between silk and polyester. The boutique manager, a sharply dressed woman named Marie, stood nearby looking incredibly uncomfortable. She had my $3,000 dress order form attached to her clipboard waiting for a credit card that my mother had just flatly refused to provide. In the past, this was the exact moment I would have shrunk into myself. I would have quietly gone back into the dressing room, taken off the gown I loved, and cried silently during the entire drive home. I would have let them make me feel small. But not today. Today, I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to defend Jamal. I did not shed a single tear. I simply turned to Marie, the manager, and smiled a warm, terrifyingly polite smile. Marie, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and exceptionally pleasant. I will be taking this wedding dress. In fact, I have decided I want to purchase your entire VIP bridal and evening wear collection that is currently on display in this showroom. Every single piece on the floor. Marie blinked rapidly, her pen freezing over her clipboard. "Excuse me, Miss Jackson?" she stammered, unsure if she had heard me correctly. I reached into my bridal purse and pulled out my heavy, solid metal corporate black card. The kind of card that does not have a spending limit. The kind of card my parents desperately wished they qualified for but never could. I held it out to her, the metal catching the light of the chandelier. "You heard me," I said clearly, ensuring my voice echoed off the boutique walls. "I am buying the entire luxury collection, including the silver evening gown my sister is currently wearing. Tell her to take it off immediately." Chloe spun around, her mouth dropping open in genuine shock. "You cannot do that," she snapped, her voice pitching upward in sudden panic. "Mom promised me this dress. I need this dress for the gala." I looked directly at my sister, my expression entirely unbothered and cold. "Mom can promise you whatever she wants, Chloe," I replied smoothly. "But Mom's credit cards are currently maxed out paying for your husband's hidden legal fees, and my card actually clears. So take off my property." My mother turned a blotchy, furious shade of purple. "Nia, how dare you speak to your sister that way?" she yelled, stepping toward me with her fists clenched. "You are making a massive fool of yourself. What are you even going to do with a $15,000 maternity evening gown? You are out of your mind." I turned back to the boutique manager, who was staring at my black card like it was a holy relic. "Marie," I instructed, calmly ignoring my mother's outburst entirely. "Please carefully pack up that silver gown, just as soon as my sister removes it. I am going to have my executive assistant drop it off at the downtown women's homeless shelter this afternoon. I want to donate it. Because clearly the other women sitting in this room simply cannot afford to pay for it themselves." The absolute silence in the boutique was deafening. Chloe let out a loud, humiliated sob and ran back into the fitting room, slamming the heavy wooden door behind her. My mother stood completely paralyzed, her hands shaking violently with a mixture of profound public embarrassment and uncontrollable rage. She had brought me here specifically to remind me of my place at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the boutique staff, and I had just publicly bought out the entire luxury store simply to put her in hers. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes narrowing into dangerous, hateful slits. "You think you are so incredibly smart because you sell teeth-whitening treatments to desperate housewives," she hissed, her voice shaking with venom. "You think you can humiliate me and Chloe like this, and still get your perfect little wedding day? Think again, you ungrateful brat. I put the massive deposit down on your reception venue, in my own name. I am calling the country club right now. I am canceling the entire event. You and your street trash fiancé can host your reception in a public parking lot for all I care." She pulled her phone from her designer bag, glaring at me triumphantly. expecting me to finally break. She was expecting me to panic, to drop to my knees, and apologize for disrespecting them, just to save the most exclusive wedding venue in the city. I simply took another sip of my complimentary champagne, savoring the crisp taste on my tongue, and looked her dead in the eye. "Go right ahead, mother," I said, my voice dripping with sweet cold satisfaction. "Call the general manager, cancel the reservation under your name. But it is not going to matter at all, because I bought the actual land that country club sits on yesterday morning. I am their new landlord." My mother's phone slipped from her trembling hand, clattering loudly onto the hardwood floor of the boutique. She stared at me, the blood completely draining from her face as the sheer magnitude of my actual wealth finally began to set in. She had no leverage left. I turned around and walked gracefully back into my fitting room to change out of my wedding dress, feeling like I had finally won the ultimate war. But as I stood there unzipping my gown in the quiet of the fitting room, I had no idea that I had just backed a highly venomous snake into a corner. I genuinely thought my financial dominance would force them into submission and secure my peace. But I severely underestimated the depths of my father's arrogance and my mother's cruelty. Their retaliation for this boutique humiliation was going to be far more ruthless and far more personal than a simple canceled venue. Less than 48 hours after I left my mother speechless in the middle of that bridal boutique, the inevitable summons arrived. It was not a phone call. It was a formal, chillingly brief text message from my father demanding my immediate presence at the family estate. I knew exactly what this was. This was the Empire striking back. When I arrived at the sprawling Buckhead mansion, the housekeeper silently directed me to my father's private study. The room was a monument to Marcus Jackson's massive ego. Dark mahogany bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with medical journals and awards he had paid public relations firms to win for him. I stood silently in front of the massive stone fireplace at the back of the room. The flames crackled and popped, casting long, dark shadows that stretched across the Persian rug and climbed the mahogany walls, making my silhouette appear towering and larger than life. My father sat behind his imposing antique desk, swirling a crystal glass of expensive scotch. He did not look up when I entered. He let the heavy silence stretch, a classic intimidation tactic he had used on me since I was a little girl. Finally, he reached into his leather briefcase and tossed a thick manila folder onto the center of his desk. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. "Your little vanity project is officially over, Nia," he stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He leaned back in his leather chair, looking at me with an expression of absolute disgust. I did not move from my spot by the fire. I simply raised a single eyebrow, waiting for him to play his hand. My father sneered, tapping the folder with his index finger. "Those 3 new commercial properties you leased in Midtown and Buckhead, the ones you are trying to turn into your new flagship luxury medical spas, they are completely frozen. As a senior voting member of the state medical board, I personally initiated an emergency review of your operating licenses this morning. I cited severe zoning technicalities and pending compliance violations. The city has placed an indefinite freeze on your construction and your medical permits. You cannot open those doors. You cannot operate. You are financially paralyzed." The sheer vindictiveness of his actions hung heavy in the warm air of the study. My clinics were not just casual spas. They were highly advanced, multi-million-dollar dental and aesthetic medical centers that employed dozens of top-tier specialists. I had spent the last 2 years securing the perfect locations to expand my brand. My father knew this expansion was the crown jewel of my professional career, and he had used his political weight on the medical board to completely sabotage it. "You actually thought you could walk into a bridal boutique, humiliate your mother and disrespect your sister without facing the consequences?" he asked, his voice rising in volume. "You are out of your mind. You think because you have a little bit of new money, you can suddenly dictate the terms of this family." He stood up, slamming his palms flat against his desk, his face twisting with a deeply rooted, ugly resentment. "Let us get one thing straight, Nia. You are nothing but a college dropout. You walked away from a real medical degree because you were too weak to handle the rigorous pressure. Now you sell glorified mixing creams, teeth whitening kits, and cosmetic injections to bored housewives. You are not a real doctor. You are an esthetician playing dress up in a lab coat. You are a complete fraud. Chloe is a real doctor. Chloe has the pedigree. And you will never under any circumstances be permitted to be more successful than your sister. His words were meticulously designed to hit every childhood insecurity I had ever harbored. He wanted to reduce me back to the terrified 20-year-old girl who had disappointed her prestigious family by pivoting from traditional surgery to the highly lucrative world of cosmetic dentistry and aesthetics. He wanted me to feel like a failure. But standing there with the heat of the fire radiating against my back, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold clinical detachment. So what is the ransom? I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. My father smiled a predatory, satisfied grin. He thought he had me cornered. You are going to sign over 40% of your entire company's equity directly to Chloe, he demanded. Bradley's political campaign needs significant financial backing, and Chloe deserves the financial security. You will transfer the shares by Friday. If you do, I will make a few phone calls, clear up your little zoning issues, and let you open your clinics. If you refuse, I will personally ensure those buildings sit empty until you are bankrupt. You will lose everything. I looked down at him from my vantage point by the hearth. He was so arrogant, so blinded by his own perceived supremacy, that he truly believed a seat on a state board made him a god. He thought he held all the cards. I slowly opened my designer purse and pulled out my phone. I did not shed a tear. I did not scream. I did not beg for his mercy. Who are you calling? My father snapped, his smile faltering slightly. Your lawyers cannot save you from a state board injunction. I am not calling my lawyers, I replied smoothly. I unlocked my screen and pressed a number on my favorites list. I tapped the speaker icon and set the phone down gently on the edge of his mahogany desk. The line rang twice before a deep, booming voice answered. Nia, the voice belonged to Governor Richard Davis, the highest-ranking executive official in the state of Georgia, and the man who personally appointed every single member of the medical board. It is wonderful to hear from you. To what do I owe the pleasure? My father's face instantly drained of all color. He collapsed back into his leather chair, staring at the glowing phone as if it were a live grenade. Governor Davis, I said, keeping my tone bright and conversational, I am so sorry to bother you during your busy day. I am currently sitting in my father's study. It seems there has been a slight administrative mix-up. Marcus is claiming that the medical board has frozen the permits for my 3 new flagship clinics due to pending compliance reviews. There was a sharp, dangerous silence on the other end of the line. When Governor Davis spoke again, his warm tone had vanished, replaced by the icy authority of a seasoned politician. Frozen Nia, you are the single largest private donor to my re-election campaign. Your new clinics are projected to bring hundreds of jobs and massive tax revenue to this district. Marcus is sitting right there. Yes, sir, I replied, making direct eye contact with my father, who was now sweating profusely. Marcus, the governor, barked through the speaker. I do not know what kind of petty family dispute you are trying to drag into my state departments, but you will lift that freeze immediately. In fact, consider yourself recused from any board decisions regarding Nia's businesses permanently. If those clinics do not have their permits fully expedited by tomorrow morning, I will ask for your resignation from the medical board by tomorrow afternoon. Do I make myself absolutely clear? My father swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. Yes, Governor, he croaked, his voice barely a whisper, crystal clear. I smiled, picking up my phone. Thank you, Governor. I will see you at the charity gala next week. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my purse. I looked at my father, who was staring blankly at his desk, his entire world of power and influence completely shattered in less than 3 minutes. Your little board seat is a cute hobby, Dad, I said softly, turning toward the heavy oak doors. But I am the economy. Do not ever try to threaten my business again. I walked out of the study, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors of the hallway. I felt an incredible rush of adrenaline. I had just dismantled my father's ultimate weapon and secured my empire. But as I reached for the front door handle, my phone began to vibrate wildly in my purse. It was a direct call from my private wealth manager at Vanguard Trust. I answered it immediately, expecting a routine update on my accounts. Nia, my manager, said, his voice laced with absolute undisguised panic. I need you to confirm a transaction immediately. A $2 million line of credit was just approved and mortgaged against the new estate you purchased last month. The funds are currently being wired to an offshore holding account. I stopped dead in my tracks, the blood freezing in my veins. The massive historic estate Jamal and I had just bought was completely paid off in cash. What are you talking about? I demanded, my heart hammering against my ribs. I did not authorize any mortgage. Who signed the guarantor papers? There was an agonizingly long pause on the other end of the line. Nia, the manager, whispered. The signature on the authorization forms belongs to your husband. Jamal signed the papers this morning. I hung up the phone, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The drive back to our new estate was a blur of adrenaline and disbelief. Jamal and I had closed on the property just last week. It was our sanctuary, paid for completely in cash, a testament to everything we had built together from nothing. And now my wealth manager was telling me my own husband had mortgaged it to the tune of $2 million. I slammed the heavy oak front door open and marched straight down the hallway to Jamal's home office. He was sitting at his multi-monitor desk, typing rapidly, complex code scrolling across 3 different screens. He looked up, his warm smile instantly fading when he saw my face. I dropped my purse onto the glass coffee table and asked him directly what he had signed that morning. Jamal looked completely confused. He calmly explained that he had met Bradley for breakfast at the country club. Bradley had reached out claiming he wanted to clear the air after the engagement party disaster. Over coffee, Bradley had pitched him a highly exclusive private equity venture backed by the Sterling Family Trust. He framed it as an olive branch, an insider opportunity to bring Jamal into the family's prestigious inner financial circle. Bradley had brought a stack of incredibly dense, sophisticated legal documents. Jamal, wanting nothing more than to finally earn my family's respect and build a bridge with my brother-in-law, had reviewed the basic terms of the joint venture and signed the guarantor paperwork. My blood ran completely cold. I pulled up the encrypted financial report on my phone and shoved it into Jamal's hands. I watched the color drain from his beautiful face as he read the stark truth. There was no Sterling Family Trust. There was no exclusive joint venture. Bradley's real estate firm was drowning in millions of dollars of hidden debt, and he was days away from defaulting on multiple federal loans. The documents Bradley had slipped into that stack were a blind collateral agreement. Bradley had manipulated Jamal into using our fully paid-off estate to secure a $2 million emergency loan for a ghost company. Bradley had stolen our home to save his own sinking ship. Jamal dropped the phone onto the desk, his hands shaking with a mixture of profound shock and rising fury. He had been played. Bradley had weaponized Jamal's good heart and his desire for family unity to commit absolute fraud. Jamal immediately stood up, grabbing his keys, declaring he was going to drive to Bradley's office and drag him directly to the police station. I grabbed his arm and stopped him. I told him we were going to the source. We drove straight to my parents' estate. I did not bother knocking. I marched through the front doors with Jamal right behind me and found my parents sitting in the formal living room. My mother was casually flipping through a designer jewelry catalog while my father poured himself another glass of scotch. They looked up, visibly annoyed by the sudden intrusion. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I laid out the entire fraudulent scheme. I told them that their precious aristocratic son-in-law was entirely broke. I told them Bradley had just committed severe bank fraud by tricking Jamal into mortgaging our home to secure a $2 million lifeline for his failing business. I demanded they call Chloe and Bradley immediately to reverse the wire transfer before I contacted the federal authorities. I expected shock. I expected my father to be outraged that another man had jeopardized his daughter's assets. I expected my mother to panic over the potential legal scandal that would surely ruin their country club reputation. Instead, my father simply took a slow sip of his scotch and sighed, looking at Jamal with blatant condescension. He set his glass down on the crystal coaster and shook his head. "You are overreacting, Nia," my father said, his voice completely devoid of concern. "Bradley did not steal anything. He is a Sterling. He simply needed a temporary bridge loan to facilitate a massive commercial development project. He was just leveraging your liquid assets for cash flow. It is standard business practice among the elite. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the sheer absurdity of his words. He committed fraud, Dad. He lied about the documents and used our property as collateral without disclosing the massive debt. That is a felony. My mother snapped her catalog shut and rolled her eyes. Oh, please, Nia, stop using such ugly words. Bradley's grandfather is a federal judge. His family has been shaping the political landscape of Georgia for generations. You and Jamal should be honored that Bradley trusted you enough to include you in a sterling enterprise. You have more cash than you know what to do with anyway. Let the man use the house as collateral. It is an absolute privilege to support a family with that kind of historical legacy. The room went dead silent. I looked at my mother, then at my father. The ugly, putrid truth of their mindset was finally and fully exposed, stripped of all its polite country club wrapping. My parents were so deeply infected by their own internalized racism and classism that they were actively defending a white man who had just robbed their black daughter. They viewed my wealth, the millions I had built through my own sweat and intelligence, as nothing more than a convenient resource to prop up a failing aristocratic white family. They were perfectly willing to let Bradley steal from me, to let him jeopardize my husband's future, as long as it kept Chloe's fake royal status intact. Jamal took a step forward, his jaw tight, his voice dangerously low. I am giving him exactly 24 hours to return the funds, or I am going straight to the police. My father actually laughed. You will do no such thing, boy, if you try to drag the Sterling name through the mud. Judge Harrison Sterling will personally ensure you are tied up in litigation for the rest of your natural life. He will crush you. You do not bite the hand of the people who elevate you. You learn your place and you play your part. Now get out of my house before you embarrass yourselves further. I did not say another word. I simply turned around and walked out the front door, pulling Jamal with me. I did not need to hear anything else. The invisible tether that had bound me to my parents, that desperate lingering hope that they would one day protect me and value me, snapped completely. They were entirely rotten. They were willing to sacrifice my life on the altar of their fake prestige. When we got back into the car, Jamal hit the steering wheel with the palm of his hand, cursing himself for being so trusting, for wanting to belong to a family that viewed him as disposable trash. He was drowning in guilt, apologizing repeatedly for putting our home at risk. I reached across the console and placed both of my hands firmly over his. I looked into his eyes, forcing him to meet my gaze. I told him to stop apologizing. I told him to breathe. Bradley thinks he played us, Jamal. I said, my voice eerily calm and calculated. Bradley thinks he won because he assumes you are just some gullible guy from the wrong side of the tracks. He relies on his grandfather's name to intimidate people. But Bradley is an idiot, and my parents are fools. Jamal frowned, still tense with anger. Nia, the money is already in an offshore holding account. The paper trail is buried behind 3 shell companies. I smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that made Jamal sit back against his seat. I squeezed his hands tightly. They forgot who you are, Jamal. They see a black man they think is beneath them, and they completely ignore your actual genius. You built the back-end security architecture for the primary credit union that manages the Sterling Family Trust. You know the exact digital footprint of their entire financial network. Bradley wants to play a game of hidden assets. We are going to show him what real exposure looks like. We are not just going to get our money back. We are going straight for the head of the snake. We are going to dismantle Judge Harrison Sterling. I settled deeply into the plush velvet armchair in the corner of Jamal's home office, slowly crossing my legs. The warm, ambient light from his desk lamp cut through the dim room, casting a sharp, deliberate shadow across the wall and illuminating the cold, precise smile forming on my lips. I was not frantic. I was not afraid. I was a woman holding the absolute key to her enemy's destruction. Jamal had just spent the last 4 hours completely bypassing the Sterling Trust's rudimentary firewalls. What he found was worse than just a ghost company. Bradley was not merely drowning in debt. He was actively funneling money through offshore accounts in a desperate, sloppy attempt at money laundering that would inevitably land him in federal prison. My phone shattered the quiet of the room. The caller ID flashed with my mother's name. Bradley had clearly panicked after our confrontation and run straight to Chloe, who immediately weaponized our mother. I answered the call, bringing the phone to my ear without saying a word. "You absolute low-class trash," my mother hissed, her voice vibrating with a frantic, ugly pitch. "Bradley just told Chloe that you are threatening to harass his grandfather with some fabricated delusional financial documents. Judge Sterling is a highly respected man. You will not dare approach him. You will not step foot near that family and embarrass your sister. You are nothing but a jealous, vindictive brat trying to climb a social ladder you do not belong on. Do you hear me, Nia? If you ruin Chloe's standing with her in-laws, I will personally see to it that you are dead to this family." I let her catch her breath, listening to her ragged, furious panting through the speaker. "I am already dead to this family, Mother," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "And I do not climb social ladders. I buy them." I ended the call, blocking her number immediately. I did not have time for the frantic barking of a woman who was about to watch her entire carefully curated universe burn to the ground. Getting an audience with Judge Harrison Sterling was notoriously difficult, but not when you knew exactly which strings to pull. I bypassed the country club channels and went directly through my elite legal connections. By Tuesday afternoon, I was walking through the heavy brass-studded doors of the judge's private chambers in downtown Atlanta. Judge Sterling was an imposing figure. At 78 years old, he had a spine made of steel and a reputation for ruthless, unwavering justice. He was a man of the old world, but unlike my parents, he did not tolerate incompetence or fraud, even from his own bloodline. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his sharp gray eyes assessing me as I approached. He did not offer a polite Southern greeting. He simply gestured for me to sit in the wingback chair opposite him. "Miss Jackson," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone that commanded absolute authority. "I am told you insisted on this meeting regarding an urgent matter concerning my grandson. I hope you are not here to discuss wedding seating arrangements." "I am not here to discuss seating arrangements, Your Honor," I said, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "I am here to discuss the survival of the Sterling family legacy." I did not waste a single second with pleasantries. I opened my leather briefcase and withdrew a thick, securely bound dossier. I slid it across the polished surface of his desk. He looked at it, then back at me, his thick white eyebrows drawing together in a stern frown. "This is a comprehensive, verified financial audit of Bradley's real estate firm, along with a detailed track record of his recent offshore wire transfers," I explained, my voice steady and clinical. "Your grandson is not just bankrupt Judge Sterling. He is currently engaging in federal bank fraud and amateur money laundering. Yesterday morning, he manipulated my husband into signing a blind collateral agreement, illegally leveraging my $2 million estate to secure a bridge loan to cover his immediate tracks." The judge did not immediately reach for the file. He stared at me, testing my resolve, looking for any trace of exaggeration or hysteria. He found none. He slowly put on his reading glasses, opened the dossier, and began to read. For 10 agonizingly long minutes, the only sound in the cavernous room was the turning of crisp paper. I watched the subtle shifts in his expression. The initial skepticism turned into deep, heavy realization, and then finally into a quiet, profound disgust. The rumors in elite circles were true. Judge Sterling despised the rot that had infected his descendants. He knew his family's wealth had dwindled, but he clearly had no idea Bradley had resorted to outright criminality. He closed the folder, pressing his fingertips against his temples. He looked suddenly older, the weight of his grandson's disgraceful actions settling heavily on his broad shoulders. "If what is in this file is accurate," the judge said slowly, "Bradley is looking at a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The scandal will completely obliterate this family's name. Why have you brought this to me instead of the authorities?" "Because I do not want justice from the authorities," I replied, leaning forward slightly. "I want a trade." He lowered his hands, looking at me with a sudden sharp curiosity. "A trade? I am fully aware of how much the Sterling name means to you, Your Honor. I know you have spent your entire life building a reputation of integrity that your grandson is about to single-handedly destroy," I stated. "I am not here to ask for your help, and I am certainly not here to beg for my money back. I am here to offer you a solution." I outlined the exact parameters of my proposal. I had the liquid capital to quietly absorb Bradley's massive fraudulent debt. I could legally purchase the failing shell companies, restructure the toxic loans, and bury the evidence of his money laundering deep within impenetrable corporate acquisitions. I would essentially erase the federal crime before the authorities even knew to look for it, saving the sterling name from a catastrophic, highly publicized downfall. "You are offering to bail him out," the judge asked, his tone laced with heavy suspicion. "After he stole from you. Why would you do that?" "I am not bailing him out. I am buying him," I corrected sharply. "If I absorb this debt, Bradley's firm belongs to me. Every asset, every liability, every property he claims to own. I will own him. He will be utterly penniless, but he will not go to prison, and your family's historical legacy will remain intact." The judge stared at me, his piercing eyes analyzing my every word. He was a man who spent his life evaluating the motives of criminals and politicians, and he could see exactly what I was doing. I was orchestrating a bloodless coup, and in exchange for saving my family from public ruin, he asked, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. "What is your price, Nia? I want one favor," I said, my gaze locking onto his. "Just one. To be executed on the day of my wedding." I leaned back in the chair waiting for his response. Judge Sterling looked down at the damning evidence of his grandson's failure, and then he looked up at me. He saw a woman who had been continuously underestimated by her own blood. A woman who possessed more strategic brilliance and ruthless execution than his entire lineage combined. A slow, respectful smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was not a smile of joy, but of absolute recognition between two apex predators. "Your parents are Marcus and Valerie Jackson," the judge stated, leaning back in his chair and folding his hands over his stomach. "They have spent the last 3 years desperately trying to leverage their way into my social circle. They parade Bradley around like he is some sort of golden prize." "They do," I agreed smoothly. "They believe he is their ticket to untouchable status." The judge let out a harsh, dry chuckle. "They are fools. They are chasing a mirage." He tapped the dossier with his index finger. "They have a daughter sitting right in front of me, who possesses enough capital and intellect to buy and sell my entire family, and they are completely blind to it. They threw you away to protect a fraud." I did not flinch. My family has always had a problem recognizing actual value. Judge Harrison Sterling closed the dossier and pushed it slightly toward the center of the desk, sealing our silent contract. He looked at me with an expression of profound, undeniable respect. He knew I held his family's survival in the palm of my hand, and he knew I had the utter ruthlessness to crush them if he refused. "Young lady," the judge said, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "Your family was blind to throw you away. You have a deal." He leaned forward, the ambient light catching the sharp, calculating gleam in his eyes. "Tell me, what exactly do you want me to do?" "I want you to attend my wedding tomorrow," I told Judge Sterling, my voice steady and completely unyielding. "I want you sitting in the front row. And when the time comes, I want you to stand up and publicly disown Bradley's actions. I want you to sever him from the Sterling Trust in front of every single politician, socialite, and reporter my parents invited. You will preserve your family name by amputating the infected limb." The judge stared at me for a long moment before giving a slow, deliberate nod. "Consider it done, Miss Jackson." 24 hours later, the rehearsal dinner was in full swing at the country club. The atmosphere in the private dining room was a chaotic, dizzying swirl of forced laughter, clinking crystal, and thick, suffocating arrogance. To anyone else, the room might have looked like a festive gathering, but through my eyes, the entire scene felt tilted completely off balance and spiraling toward a spectacular collapse. I stood near the mahogany bar, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, observing the wreckage of my family dynamics with the cold, detached precision of an executioner. My parents, Marcus and Valerie, were holding court at the grand center table. They were putting on a masterclass in passive-aggressive cruelty. They had deliberately seated Jamal's family at a small, cramped table in the far back corner, perilously close to the swinging kitchen doors. My mother actively turned her back whenever Jamal's mother, a sweet woman who had baked a batch of traditional family cookies as a gesture of goodwill, tried to initiate conversation. Valerie had taken one look at the handmade tin, wrinkled her nose, as if it contained a biohazard, and handed it directly to a passing waiter to throw away. My father was no better. He was loudly regaling his wealthy associates with tales of his recent golf trips and expensive car purchases, deliberately speaking over Jamal's father, a hard-working retired mechanic, every time the man tried to speak. It was a calculated, systematic effort to make Jamal's family feel as small and insignificant as possible. I scanned the room and found my sister. Chloe was making an absolute spectacle of herself near the catered buffet. She wore a skin-tight designer dress that blatantly ignored the formal dress code, posing and preening for anyone who would look her way. She picked up a silver serving spoon, examined the roasted vegetables, and let out a loud theatrical sigh that carried easily over the soft melodies of the hired string quartet. Polenta and braised short ribs, Chloe sneered. Turning to a group of my mother's wealthy friends, she held her plate away from her body, as if the food was an insult. This is so utterly pedestrian. Bradley's family usually serves uga, caviar, and imported wagyu for events like this. But I suppose we have to be realistic and accommodate Jamal's budget. We cannot expect people who buy their clothes off the rack to understand the nuances of fine dining. A few of the women chuckled politely, throwing sympathetic glances toward my parents for having to endure such a tragic downgrade in social status. I felt a surge of pure rage, but I kept my breathing even and my face completely blank. Across the room, Bradley had cornered Jamal near the towering ice sculpture. Bradley was already flushed, sweating slightly, and clearly deep into his third or fourth scotch. He slung a heavy, patronizing arm around Jamal's shoulder, leaning in close with a sloppy, arrogant grin. "Listen to me," Bradley slurred, tapping Jamal on the chest with a heavy finger. "Do not worry about that little paperwork we signed, little bro. That investment is going to pay off tenfold. I know it seems like a lot of money to a guy like you, but you just have to consider it tuition. It is the cost of entering the elite. You have to spend big money to make big money in our world. You will thank me when the dividends start rolling in." Jamal's jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. He was staring at Bradley with a look of barely contained violence, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. I knew exactly what Jamal was thinking. He knew Bradley was a thief. He knew Bradley had mortgaged our future to save his own miserable life. But Jamal was holding his temper, waiting for my signal. The clinking of silverware against crystal shattered the low hum of conversation. My father stood at the head of the main table, holding up his glass of vintage champagne. The room immediately quieted, waiting for the patriarch to deliver his blessing. Marcus puffed out his chest, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, deliberately skipping over Jamal and his parents. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate Nia's wedding," he began, his voice booming across the dining hall. "As a father, you always want what is best for your children. You want them to secure a proper, stable future. It is an absolute shame Nia did not learn more from her sister Chloe about how to navigate the world and align herself with established success." A shocked, suffocating silence fell over Jamal's family. Chloe smirked, tossing her hair over her shoulder, completely basking in the praise. Valerie nodded in profound agreement, raising her glass to her favored daughter. "But we all make our own choices," my father continued, his tone dripping with acidic condescension. "We cannot force our children to embrace greatness. Some are simply destined to settle for mediocrity." He finally turned his gaze to me, his eyes cold and mocking. "Anyway, let us hope this little marriage experiment lasts more than 2 years. Cheers." He drank from his glass. The silence in the room was deafening. It was a public execution of my character, an outright humiliation of my fiancé, and a blatant declaration of war against Jamal's entire family. Jamal had reached his absolute limit. I heard his sharp intake of breath. He stepped forward, his eyes locked onto my father, his shoulders tense and ready to snap. He was going to cross the room and knock Marcus Jackson straight to the floor. I moved instantly. I grabbed Jamal's forearm, my manicured nails digging sharply through the fabric of his suit jacket. I stood directly in front of him, blocking his path, my eyes burning into his. "Not yet," I whispered fiercely, my voice low enough that only he could hear. "Do not give them the satisfaction of calling you a violent thug. Let them dig the grave deeper. Tomorrow we bury them in it. Jamal stared at me, his chest heaving, the anger practically vibrating off his skin. But he trusted me. He slowly uncurled his fists, taking a deep, shuddering breath, and stepped back. I turned to face the room. Every eye was on me, expecting me to run out in tears, expecting me to crumble under the weight of my father's public abuse. Instead, I calmly picked up a fresh flute of champagne from a passing tray. I picked up a silver spoon and tapped it lightly against the crystal. The sharp, high-pitched ringing commanded immediate attention. I smiled. It was a wide, brilliant, terrifyingly hollow smile. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice carrying clearly and pleasantly across the silent room. "Thank you for your boundless, inspiring support. And Mom, thank you for showing us exactly what true family values look like tonight." I turned my gaze to my brother-in-law, who was leaning heavily against the bar. "And a very special thank you to Bradley for that invaluable lesson in elite finance. You have truly shown Jamal and me how the upper echelon operates." I raised my glass high in the air, my eyes locking onto my father's sudden suspicious frown. "Tonight is about family. But tomorrow is about the future. Tomorrow I promise to deliver a surprise that the Jackson and Sterling families will never ever forget." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. Across the room, resting on a high-top cocktail table, Bradley's phone suddenly lit up. It vibrated violently, sliding a few inches across the polished wood. Then it vibrated again, and again. Red alert notifications began flooding his locked screen, indicating catastrophic critical failures across multiple offshore banking accounts. The digital trap Jamal had coded was finally springing shut, locking Bradley out of his own stolen funds and triggering massive security protocols within the federal banking network. But Bradley did not notice. He was far too drunk, far too arrogant, and far too busy, laughing at my toast, to realize that his entire life had just been permanently deleted. The morning of my wedding dawned with the kind of crisp, clear blue sky that brides pray for. I stood in the center of the cathedral bridal suite, my eyes locked on the face of my diamond watch. The second hand swept past the 12 in a steady, relentless rhythm. The calm I felt was absolute, but the atmosphere outside the heavy wooden doors of my suite was spiraling into pure chaos. My wedding planner, a usually unflappable woman named Sarah, burst into the room, clutching her clipboard against her chest like a shield. Her face was entirely drained of color. "Nia," Sarah gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "We have a massive problem. The floral delivery trucks just bypassed the loading dock, and the string quartet you booked for the bridal procession just sent an automated email. They are not coming. The entire vendor list for the ceremony was canceled at 6 o'clock this morning." I did not panic. I simply turned away from the mirror and looked at her. "Canceled by whom?" Sarah swallowed hard, looking down at her clipboard. "By the primary account holder, who placed the initial deposits. Valerie Jackson. Your mother called every single vendor personally and completely liquidated the aesthetic budget. The cathedral is completely bare." I nodded slowly, processing the petty, vindictive reality of my mother's final sabotage. She and my father genuinely believed Bradley had outsmarted Jamal. They believed my husband was currently $2 million in debt to a federal bank, and they wanted to publicly humiliate me on the most important day of my life to ensure I knew my place. They wanted me walking down a barren aisle in silence. I reached for my phone and dialed my mother's number. She answered on the very first ring, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, arrogant satisfaction. "Good morning," the beautiful bride, Valerie cooed. "I assume you are calling about the little logistical changes." "Why did you cancel the vendors, Mother?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat. Valerie let out a sharp, condescending sigh. "Honestly, Nia, I am doing you a massive favor. Bradley informed us about Jamal's little financial predicament last night. Since your husband just recklessly gambled away your home, I thought it was highly inappropriate to waste thousands of dollars on imported peonies and musicians. I think you need to use that flower money to pay your husband's new debts. Let us not be ostentatious when you are practically bankrupt. Do not make a scene today, Nia. A quiet, humble little ceremony is more your speed right now anyway." She hung up the phone, completely convinced she had just delivered a fatal, humiliating blow. She thought I was standing in the bridal suite crying over empty vases in a silent cathedral. I looked at Sarah, who was vibrating with secondhand anxiety, waiting for me to break down. Sarah, I instructed calmly. Take a breath. This is not a crisis. This is a minor pivot. I pulled up my contacts and dialed the public relations director for my med spa empire. Next week, my company was scheduled to host a massive VIP corporate gala at the High Museum to celebrate our regional expansion. We had ordered a staggering amount of floral arrangements for the event. Listen to me carefully, I said the moment my director answered. I need you to redirect the entire Dutch floral shipment from the museum holding facility directly to the cathedral. Every single white orchid, every cascading hydrangea, every white rose we imported. I want the delivery trucks here in 20 minutes, and I want the entire installation crew working double time to cover every square inch of this sanctuary. I ended the call and immediately dialed another number. As the founder of a highly lucrative medical enterprise, I required significant tax write-offs, which is why my company was the primary diamond sponsor for the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. I had personally funded their entire summer concert series. I called the orchestra's managing director. I skipped the pleasantries entirely. I need a favor, I stated. I need 30 of your principal string and woodwind musicians at the cathedral in exactly 1 hour. Yes, full formal concert attire. I want a complete symphonic arrangement for my walk down the aisle. Bill my corporate account for whatever emergency overtime rates apply. I placed my phone back on the vanity and looked at Sarah. Her jaw was practically touching the floor. Get the cathedral doors open, Sarah. The trucks are on their way. Within 2 hours, the empty, quiet cathedral was transformed into something out of a royal coronation. The sheer volume of the imported Dutch flowers was staggering. Tens of thousands of pristine white orchids cascaded down the stone pillars and spilled over the wooden pews like a living waterfall. The air was thick and heavy with the intoxicating, expensive scent of fresh roses. In the choir loft, 30 members of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra were tuning their instruments, the rich, resonant sounds of cellos and violins echoing off the vaulted ceilings. It was a display of wealth and power so overwhelming it bordered on intimidating. At exactly 12 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the cathedral vestibule swung open. Valerie and Chloe walked in, flanked by my father and the rest of my extended family. They had arrived early specifically to gloat. They walked in expecting to find me weeping in a sterile, silent room. They expected to see a cheap, embarrassing spectacle. Instead, they hit a literal wall of orchids. My mother stopped dead in her tracks. The smug, victorious smile completely vanished from her face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. She stared at the sweeping floral installations, her eyes darting wildly up to the massive symphony orchestra, tuning their instruments in the loft. Chloe stood beside her, her mouth hanging open, her face turning an ugly, blotchy shade of red, as the sheer magnitude of the luxury registered in her brain. Chloe had spent a fortune trying to make her own wedding look expensive, and my makeshift last-minute emergency response had just completely eclipsed her entire existence. The jealousy radiating off my sister was so intense it was practically visible. Valerie's hands began to shake. She realized instantly that her sabotage had not broken me. It had only given me an excuse to flex a level of financial dominance she could not even begin to comprehend. Bradley's supposed victory over Jamal had clearly not put a dent in my armor. We were not bankrupt. We were untouchable. The realization twisted my mother's shock into pure venomous malice. She turned to my father, whispering furiously into his ear, her eyes flashing with a desperate need to reclaim control. Marcus stared at the orchestra, his jaw set in a hard, furious line. He had tried to break my business. Valerie had tried to ruin my wedding day. And yet here I was, commanding the very city they desperately wanted to rule. Marcus pulled his phone from the breast pocket of his tailored suit. His thumbs moved aggressively across the screen. Upstairs in the bridal suite, my phone chimed a sharp, piercing sound against the marble vanity. I picked it up. It was a text message from my father. It read, "You can buy all the flowers in Europe, but you cannot buy a father's respect. You have publicly disrespected your mother, and your husband has insulted this family's intelligence. I will not be walking a fraud down the aisle today. You are on your own. Do not expect us at the reception." It was the ultimate psychological kill shot. The final desperate attempt to break my spirit right before the most vulnerable moment of a woman's life. He wanted me to walk out of these doors alone. He wanted the hundreds of guests to whisper and stare as the bride walked herself down the aisle, visibly abandoned by the patriarch of her family. He thought the public shame of a fatherless procession would finally force me to my knees. I read the text message twice. The words should have shattered me. They should have triggered a massive panic attack. But as I stared at the screen, a strange, beautiful clarity washed over my mind. They had finally played their last card. There was nothing left to fear. I looked up from my phone. I instructed the makeup artist and the stylist to leave the room. I told Sarah to clear the hallway. I wanted complete silence. The only person who remained was Keisha standing faithfully by the door. I walked slowly across the suite toward the velvet sofa. I did not shed a single tear. I did not mourn the loss of a father who had never truly been mine to begin with. I reached out my hand perfectly steady and picked up the heavy crystal decanter of Cabernet from the hospitality cart. I poured a single precise measure of the dark red wine into a crystal glass. The rich aroma filled the quiet space, a stark contrast to the frantic energy that had occupied the room just moments before. I did not drink to calm my nerves. My pulse was perfectly steady, my hands completely still. I raised the glass to my reflection in the gilded mirror, offering a silent toast to the death of the dutiful, obedient daughter my parents thought they could control. I swallowed the wine, feeling its heat slide down my throat, and set the glass back onto the silver tray with a soft, definitive clink. I turned to Keisha. She stood by the door, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and anticipation. "It is time," I told her. We walked out of the bridal suite and moved through the hushed, carpeted corridors of the cathedral. The air grew cooler as we approached the main vestibule. The heavy, intricately carved oak doors of the sanctuary stood closed before me. But even through the thick wood, the magnificent booming vibrations of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra reverberated against the floorboards. The rich resonance of 30-string and woodwind instruments filled the space with a regal, undeniable power. I stood in the center of the vestibule, smoothing the heavy silk skirt of my custom gown. It was not just a wedding dress. Today, it was armor. The cathedral clock chimed the quarter hour. Right on the final stroke, the heavy brass-handled side door of the vestibule swung open. Judge Harrison Sterling stepped into the room. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue morning coat, his silver hair impeccably combed, his posture as straight and unyielding as a steel beam. He exuded the kind of raw generational authority that could silence a courtroom with a single glance. He stopped a few feet away from me, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over my dress, the calm expression on my face, and the sheer magnitude of the moment we were about to orchestrate. "You look like a woman prepared to conquer a city," Miss Jackson, the judge said, his gravelly voice carrying a note of profound respect. "I am prepared to burn one down and build a better one on the ashes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "Thank you for coming. I would not have missed this for the world," he stated. He stepped forward and extended his right arm toward me. "Shall we?" I slipped my arm through his, resting my hand lightly against his sleeve. Keisha knelt behind me, adjusting the long, sweeping lace train of my gown one final time before stepping back into the shadows. I took a deep, centering breath. "Open the doors." The doors, I commanded the cathedral attendants. The symphony inside seamlessly transitioned from their prelude into a soaring, triumphant rendition of the bridal march. The massive oak doors slowly pulled outward, unleashing a blinding wave of light and the overwhelming, intoxicating scent of tens of thousands of imported white orchids. The immediate visual impact was staggering. The cathedral was packed shoulder to shoulder with Atlanta's elite. Hundreds of guests turned in their pews, their faces alight with polite anticipation, expecting to see me walking alone, a disgraced bride abandoned by her father. Instead, they saw me. And they saw the Titan walking beside me. A collective audible gasp rippled through the cavernous sanctuary. The sound of hushed, frantic whispering ignited, instantly buzzing like electricity beneath the booming melody of the orchestra. I kept my chin perfectly level, my eyes focused straight ahead, but I missed absolutely nothing. My gaze swept the front row. Bradley had arrogantly smuggled a glass of red wine into the sanctuary to nurse his hangover, leaning casually against the polished wood of the pew. The moment his bloodshot eyes landed on his grandfather escorting me down the aisle, his entire body seized. The crystal wine glass slipped through his trembling fingers, hitting the marble floor with a sharp, violent crash. The dark red liquid splashed across the pristine white stones, spreading like a pool of blood at his feet. He did not even flinch at the sound. He just stood there, his mouth hanging open, his face turning an unnatural, sickly shade of gray, as the reality of his impending doom finally crushed him. Beside him, Chloe was gripping the edge of the wooden pew so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Her perfectly curated smug expression had completely melted off her face. She stared at the judge, the grandfather-in-law, she paraded around as her ultimate social trophy, the man who supposedly despised her sister. Her jaw was unhinged, her eyes darting frantically between me and the imposing patriarch of the Sterling family. Her entire social hierarchy, the delicate, arrogant universe she had built upon my perceived inferiority, was disintegrating before her very eyes. I continued my slow, deliberate march down the white aisle runner. Every step felt like a drumbeat of absolute victory. I did not look for my parents immediately. I knew exactly where they were. Marcus and Valerie had deliberately taken seats in the very last row of the cathedral. They had positioned themselves near the exit, intending to watch my solitary, humiliating walk down the aisle and then slip out the back doors to avoid the reception. As the judge and I passed their row, I turned my head slightly to look at them. They had both shot up from their seats. Valerie was clutching her designer purse against her chest, her mouth clamped shut, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen her display. But it was my father's face that provided the ultimate satisfaction. Marcus Jackson was a man who prided himself on control, on strategic manipulation, on always holding the winning hand. But as he stared at Judge Harrison Sterling, the blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. I watched the exact agonizing second his brain connected the dots. Judge Sterling was not merely Bradley's grandfather. He was the primary trustee and the sole financial patron of the Sterling Medical Endowment. That endowment was the singular financial pillar that kept Marcus's private hospital network afloat. My father had spent the last decade aggressively courting the judge's favor to secure those grants. He had thrown me away to protect Bradley, believing the Sterling name would shield him. And now he realized the terrifying truth. I had not just bypassed his authority. I had completely captured the one man who held the power to eradicate Marcus's entire professional empire with a single phone call. My father slumped back against the wooden pew, his legs seemingly unable to support his weight. He was a ruined man and he knew it. I turned my gaze back to the altar. Jamal stood there waiting for me. He wore a custom-tailored black tuxedo, looking incredibly handsome, incredibly regal. He knew the parameters of my plan, but seeing it executed with such flawless, overwhelming precision brought a look of absolute, undeniable pride to his face. There was no fear in his eyes. There was no intimidation regarding the wealth or the power in the room. He looked at me as an equal, a partner, a king welcoming his queen. When the judge and I finally reached the end of the long aisle, the symphony brought the march to a gentle, sweeping conclusion. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the suspended breath of 500 guests, waiting to see what would happen next. Jamal stepped forward, offering me a warm, reassuring smile. Normally, this was the moment the father of the bride would place his daughter's hand into the groom's hand and step back to take his seat. Judge Harrison Sterling did not step back. He held his ground, his presence dominating the altar space. He turned toward the officiating priest, an older man who was clearly intimidated by the legendary legal titan standing before him. The judge extended his hand and politely but firmly requested the wireless microphone resting on the wooden pulpit. The priest did not hesitate. He handed it over immediately and stepped back into the shadows of the altar. The judge tapped the microphone once. The sharp thud echoed through the massive cathedral speakers, demanding absolute, unwavering attention. He turned to face the congregation. His piercing gray eyes swept over the crowd, lingering specifically on the back row where my parents sat paralyzed, and then shifting to the front row, locking onto the pale, sweating face of his grandson. Today the judge began, his gravelly, authoritative baritone voice vibrating through every corner of the stone cathedral. I have the profound honor of walking the most remarkable, intelligent, and formidable woman I have ever met down this aisle." He placed a steady, respectful hand on my shoulder before looking directly at Marcus and Valerie. "And while I am standing here before God and before this city, I have a brief, highly necessary announcement for the Jackson family." From my vantage point on the elevated marble altar, I possessed a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire congregation. The air in the sanctuary was thick, heavy with the intoxicating scent of tens of thousands of imported white orchids and the sharp, crackling electricity of impending doom. I let my gaze sweep slowly over the pews, savoring the absolute paralysis gripping the people who had spent their entire lives trying to make me feel small. I watched the beads of sweat forming on Bradley's pale forehead. He was still staring at his phone, his thumb swiping frantically across the dark screen, his mind completely unable to process the total liquidation of his illicit offshore assets. I watched Chloe's perfectly contoured face contort into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She was tugging at Bradley's sleeve, whispering harshly, but he was completely unresponsive, a hollow shell of the arrogant man he had been just 24 hours prior. Then I looked all the way to the back row, locking eyes with my mother and father. Valerie was clutching Marcus's arm so tightly, her manicured fingers looked like claws. Marcus looked like a man standing on a trapdoor with the rope already pulled. His chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths. He knew what was happening. He just did not want to believe it. Beside me, Judge Harrison Sterling adjusted his stance. His broad shoulders squared, projecting the absolute authority of a man accustomed to handing down life-altering verdicts. He held the microphone with a steady, practiced grip. "My grandson, Bradley Sterling, is a disgrace to my family's name." The judge declared, his voice ringing with a terrifying clarity that bounced off the stained glass windows and settled deep into the bones of every person in the room. "He is a coward, a thief, and a fraud. He has engaged in highly illegal financial manipulations, money laundering, and bank fraud. He actively attempted to defraud the woman standing beside me, along with her future husband, using the Sterling name not as a shield of honor, but as a weapon of cowardice and deceit." A collective gasp ripped through the cathedral. The whispers turned into a frantic, buzzing uproar. Cell phones were already being pulled out, screens lighting up the dim pews, as Atlanta's elite scrambled to record the spectacular, unprecedented destruction of one of their own. Socialites who had kissed Valerie's cheeks an hour ago were now staring at her with wide, predatory eyes. The judge did not flinch. He raised his free hand demanding silence, and the room instantly obeyed. He raised his voice, cutting through the residual noise like a sharpened blade. "I have spent my entire life building a legacy of integrity," the judge continued, his gray eyes locking onto Bradley. "A legacy that this boy believed he could exploit to cover his own staggering incompetence. Therefore, let the public record show, and let every associate, friend, and rival of my family in this room bear witness. Effective as of this exact moment, Bradley Sterling is permanently severed from the Sterling Family Trust." Bradley's knees finally gave out. He collapsed heavily onto the wooden pew, burying his face in his hands. "He is utterly disinherited," the judge announced, striking the final nail into the coffin. "He will not receive a single cent of my capital. He will not retain access to any family properties, bank accounts, or corporate holdings. And he no longer operates under the protection or the endorsement of my name. He is on his own to face the federal consequences of his actions." The silence that slammed into the room was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a dynasty collapsing in real time. In the back row, my parents looked as though they had been physically struck by a freight train. The golden prize they had worshipped, the untouchable white son-in-law they had used to elevate their own social status and systematically demean my existence, was suddenly a penniless pariah. He was a documented criminal heading for federal prison. Everything my parents had sacrificed me for, every insult they had hurled at Jamal to protect Bradley's image, was gone. Suddenly, a shrill, hysterical shriek shattered the quiet of the sanctuary. "Grandpa, you cannot—" Chloe lunged out of her pew, stumbling over the hem of her inappropriate designer dress. Her face was twisted into a grotesque mask of entitlement and terror. She pointed a shaking finger at the altar, completely abandoning any pretense of high society decorum. The cool, collected socialite was gone, replaced by a desperate woman watching her entire fabricated universe burn to ash. "You cannot cut him off!" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing wildly across the vaulted ceilings, her chest heaving with frantic sobs. "I am your granddaughter-in-law. I am carrying your great-grandchild. I am pregnant with the Sterling heir. You have a duty to us. You have a duty to this baby." The congregation collectively held its breath. Hundreds of eyes darted from the weeping, desperate woman in the aisle up to the imposing patriarch on the altar. They were waiting to see if the sudden invocation of an unborn heir would soften the old man's heart. They clearly did not know Judge Harrison Sterling. They did not understand that a man who cut out the rot from his own lineage did not bargain with terrorists. The judge looked down at Chloe with an expression of profound glacial indifference. He did not show a single ounce of warmth, pity, or hesitation. He looked at her as if she were nothing more than a minor, irritating clerical error. "That is your problem," the judge replied, his voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing with terrifying finality through the speakers. "The Sterling family does not harbor criminals, and we certainly do not fund them." Chloe let out a strangled, pathetic wail, dropping to her knees right there in the center aisle, sobbing into her hands as the reality of her new, impoverished life crashed down upon her. Bradley did not even move to comfort her. He remained frozen in the pew, completely paralyzed by his own ruin. The judge turned off the microphone and handed it back to the trembling priest, who looked completely out of his depth. Judge Sterling turned to me. The harsh, unforgiving lines of his face softened just a fraction. He offered a stiff, deeply respectful bow of his head, acknowledging the flawless execution of our silent contract. "Congratulations on your wedding, Miss Jackson," he murmured quietly, ensuring only Jamal and I could hear. "May your future be as ruthlessly efficient as your present." "Thank you, Your Honor," I replied, bowing my head in return. Without sparing another glance at his sobbing granddaughter-in-law or his humiliated grandson, Judge Harrison Sterling descended the marble steps. He walked straight down the center aisle, parting the sea of stunned guests. The crowd physically backed away from him, giving him a wide berth as he marched out of the cathedral, his spine perfectly straight, leaving the wreckage of his own bloodline behind him, without a single ounce of regret. I stood at the altar, feeling the solid, comforting warmth of Jamal's hand enveloping mine. His grip was steady, anchoring me to the present moment. I looked past the weeping, pathetic mess of my sister kneeling on the white runner. I looked straight down the long aisle, past the rows of whispering socialites, right to the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church. My parents were standing there, completely frozen. Valerie's face was streaked with ruined makeup, her hands covering her mouth in shock. Marcus looked pale, breathless, and utterly defeated. They were staring at me, their eyes wide with the horrifying realization that the daughter they had thrown away was the one holding the match that had ignited their world. They thought the worst was over. They thought losing Bradley's status and facing the public humiliation of Chloe's breakdown was the ultimate punishment. I squeezed Jamal's hand, a slow, cold smile spreading across my lips. I watched my father pull out his own, his hands shaking violently as he tried to dial a number, desperate to salvage his crumbling hospital endowment now that his Sterling connection was dead. He had absolutely no idea that my true strike was only just beginning. The music was playing, the champagne was flowing, and the rest of my life was waiting. But even as the reception swirled around me, a brilliant blur of laughter and crystal, my mind was already executing the final fatal sequence of my strategy. I danced with my husband. I toasted with the judge. I smiled for the cameras, projecting the image of a radiant, untouchable bride. Yet beneath the surface of my joy, the digital clock was still ticking down to the absolute destruction of Valerie Jackson. The reception eventually faded into the late hours of the evening, and Jamal and I retreated to the penthouse suite of the Four Seasons. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. The city of Atlanta was still wrapped in the quiet, bruised purple of early morning twilight. I slipped out of bed, leaving Jamal sleeping peacefully, and walked into the expansive living area of the penthouse. I picked up my phone from the glass coffee table and checked the time. 6:30 in the morning. The final act was ready to commence. I had known my mother would not go down without one last desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of her shattered pride. Valerie was a woman who thrived on appearances, and losing the clinic meant losing the very foundation of her social identity. I knew she would panic. I knew she would try to liquidate her personal assets, her hidden accounts, and her jewelry collections in a frantic secret bid to scrape together enough capital to buy the clinic back before the news of their bankruptcy hit the society pages. What Valerie did not know was that I had spent the last 6 months mapping every single financial vein and artery connected to the Jackson name. Jamal's digital infiltration had not stopped at Bradley's offshore accounts. He had quietly, methodically traced my mother's private wealth management portfolios, the emergency funds she kept hidden even from my father. I sat down on the velvet sofa and opened the secure application on my phone. The screen illuminated my face with a cold blue glow. At exactly 7 o'clock, the trap was triggered. I watched the screen as the automated legal injunctions Jamal had prepared were filed simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions. Using the absolute power of my position as the primary creditor of my father's defaulted cross-collateralized loans, I placed an immediate, impenetrable freeze on all joint and personal assets tied to Marcus and Valerie Jackson. The legal justification was bulletproof, the financial entanglement so deep and toxic, thanks to Bradley's fraud, that the banks had no choice but to lock down everything to prevent capital flight. My phone vibrated violently in my hand. The caller ID flashed with my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the frantic, desperate energy radiating from the vibrating device before calmly swiping to accept the call. Nia Valerie shrieked, her voice a ragged, breathless scream that sounded completely detached from reality. What have you done? My cards are declining. The bank just called me. They locked me out of the safety deposit boxes. They froze the trust. They froze my personal accounts. You cannot do this. The clinic debt belongs to your father, not me. You cannot take my money. Her panic was absolute. She was entirely unraveled, screaming into the phone like a trapped animal. I leaned back against the sofa, my posture perfectly relaxed. You should have read the fine print on the clinic's incorporation documents. Mother, I replied, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. Dad transferred 40% of the clinic's equity into your name 10 years ago for tax purposes. You are a co-owner, which means when he used the clinic to guarantee Bradley's fraudulent loans, you became equally liable for the debt. When Bradley defaulted, you defaulted. No, Valerie wailed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. No, that is not true. I did not sign anything for Bradley. I did not agree to this. You agreed to tie your life to a man who thought he could outsmart me, I corrected sharply. You both enabled Bradley. You both chose to invest your entire family's future into a criminal because he had blue eyes and a country club membership. You threw me away, you humiliated Jamal, and you bankrupted yourselves trying to buy a social status that never actually belonged to you. I paused, listening to her ragged, hysterical hyperventilating through the speaker. You wanted me to pay for my own wedding, Mom, I asked, throwing her vicious, mocking words from the rehearsal dinner right back into her teeth. I did. I bought the venue. I bought the flowers. I bought the orchestra. And then I bought your entire life. You have absolutely nothing left. Do not ever contact me again. I ended the call. I did not block her number. I simply turned the phone off and placed it face down on the glass table. The silence that filled the penthouse was absolute, pure, and incredibly sweet. The war was over. The toxic, suffocating influence of the Jackson family had been completely eradicated from my existence. I stood up, walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, and watched the sun finally crest over the Atlanta skyline, washing the city in brilliant golden light. I felt 2 strong arms wrap around my waist from behind. Jamal rested his chin on my shoulder, pulling me back against his warm, solid chest. He looked out at the city with me. Is it finished? He asked quietly, his voice a low, comforting rumble. I leaned back into him, a genuine, unburdened smile finally gracing my face. It is finished, I whispered. We won. From my vantage point, on the elevated marble altar, I possessed a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire congregation. The air in the sanctuary was thick, heavy, with the intoxicating scent of tens of thousands of imported white orchids and the sharp, crackling electricity of impending doom. I took a slow, deliberate moment to let my gaze sweep over the pews. I wanted to sear this exact image into my memory. I savored the absolute paralysis gripping the people who had spent their entire lives trying to make me feel small. I started with Bradley. I watched the thick beads of sweat forming on his pale forehead catching the light from the massive chandeliers above. He was still staring at his phone, his thumb swiping frantically across the dark screen, his mind completely unable to process the total liquidation of his illicit offshore assets. He looked physically ill. I watched Chloe sitting right beside him. Her perfectly contoured face had contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She was tugging aggressively at Bradley's sleeve, whispering harsh, frantic demands into his ear, but he was completely unresponsive. He was a hollow shell of the arrogant, untouchable man he had pretended to be just 24 hours prior. Then I lifted my chin and looked all the way to the back row, locking eyes with my mother and father. Valerie was clutching Marcus's arm so tightly, her manicured fingers looked like talons digging into his expensive suit jacket. Marcus looked exactly like a man standing on a trapdoor, with the rope already pulled. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. He knew something catastrophic was happening. He just did not want to believe it was happening to him. Beside me, Judge Harrison Sterling adjusted his stance. His broad shoulders squared, projecting the absolute authority of a man entirely accustomed to handing down life-altering verdicts. He held the microphone with a steady, practiced grip. The cathedral was so quiet, I could hear the faint rustle of silk gowns shifting in the pews. "My grandson Bradley Sterling is a disgrace," the judge declared. His voice rang with a terrifying clarity. It bounced off the stained glass windows and settled deep into the bones of every single person in the room. He did not yell. He did not need to. The sheer gravity of his tone commanded absolute submission. "He has engaged in highly illegal financial manipulations," the judge continued, his eyes remaining fixed forward. "He actively attempted to defraud the brilliant woman standing beside me along with her future husband. He used the Sterling name not as a shield of honor, but as a weapon of cowardice, theft, and deceit." A collective violent gasp ripped through the cathedral. The initial shock instantly mutated into a frantic, buzzing uproar. Cell phones were already being pulled from designer clutches screens, lighting up the dim pews like a constellation of stars, as Atlanta's elite scrambled to record the spectacular, unprecedented destruction of one of their own. Socialites who had been kissing Valerie's cheeks an hour ago were now staring at her with wide, predatory eyes. The scent of blood was in the water, and high society was notoriously vicious. The judge did not flinch at the noise. He simply raised his free hand, demanding silence. The room instantly obeyed, snapping back to a terrified hush. He raised his voice, cutting through the residual tension like a sharpened blade. "I have spent my entire life building a legacy of unwavering integrity," the judge stated, his gray eyes finally dropping down to lock onto Bradley in the front row. "A legacy that this boy arrogantly believed he could exploit to cover his own staggering incompetence. Therefore, let the public record show, and let every associate, friend, and rival of my family in this room bear witness today. Effective as of this exact moment, Bradley Sterling is officially and permanently removed from the Sterling Family Trust." Bradley's knees finally gave out entirely. He collapsed heavily against the wooden back of the pew, burying his face in his hands. A low, wretched sound escaped his throat, but no one moved to comfort him. "He is utterly disinherited," the judge announced, striking the final fatal nail into the coffin. "He will not receive a single cent of my capital. He will not retain access to any family properties, bank accounts, or corporate holdings. He no longer operates under the protection or the endorsement of my name. The Sterling family will offer him no legal counsel. He is entirely on his own to face the severe federal consequences of his actions." The silence that slammed into the room was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a dynasty collapsing in real time. In the back row, my parents looked as though they had been physically struck by a massive freight train. The golden prize they had worshipped, the untouchable white son-in-law, they had used to elevate their own social status and systematically demean. My existence was suddenly a penniless pariah. He was a documented criminal heading straight for federal prison. Everything my parents had sacrificed me for, every insult they had hurled at Jamal to protect Bradley's sterling image was gone. Their primary source of pride had just become their ultimate source of shame. Suddenly, a shrill, hysterical shriek shattered the quiet of the sanctuary. "Grandpa, you cannot do this!" Chloe lunged out of her pew, stumbling awkwardly over the hem of her inappropriate designer dress. Her face was twisted into a grotesque mask of entitlement, rage, and pure terror. She pointed a shaking finger at the altar, completely abandoning any pretense of high society decorum. The cool, collected socialite was gone, replaced by a desperate, flailing woman, watching her entire fabricated universe burn to ash. "You cannot cut him off!" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing wildly across the vaulted ceilings, her chest heaving with frantic theatrical sobs. "I am your granddaughter-in-law. I am carrying your great-grandchild. I am pregnant with the sterling heir. You have a duty to us. You have a duty to this baby." The congregation collectively held its breath. Hundreds of eyes darted from the weeping, desperate woman in the center aisle up to the imposing patriarch standing on the altar. They were waiting to see if the sudden dramatic invocation of an unborn heir would soften the old man's heart. They clearly did not know Judge Harrison Sterling. They did not understand that a man who was willing to cut out the rot from his own lineage did not bargain with emotional terrorists. The judge looked down at Chloe with an expression of profound, glacial indifference. He did not show a single ounce of warmth, pity, or hesitation. He looked at her as if she were nothing more than a minor, irritating clerical error that needed to be expunged from a pristine record. "That is your problem," the judge replied, his voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing with terrifying finality through the massive speakers. "The Sterling family does not tolerate criminals, and we certainly do not fund them." Chloe let out a strangled, pathetic wail, dropping heavily to her knees, right there on the pristine white aisle runner. She sobbed violently into her hands as the brutal reality of her new, impoverished life crashed down upon her shoulders. Bradley did not even move to help her. He remained frozen in the pew, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own ruin. The judge turned off the microphone with a sharp click and handed it back to the trembling priest, who looked completely out of his depth. Judge Sterling turned to face me. The harsh, unforgiving lines of his face softened just a fraction. He offered a stiff, deeply respectful bow of his head, acknowledging the flawless execution of our silent contract. "Congratulations on your wedding, Miss Jackson," he murmured quietly, ensuring only Jamal and I could hear his parting words. "May your future be as ruthlessly efficient as your present." "Thank you, Your Honor," I replied, bowing my head in return, matching his level of profound respect. Without sparing another glance at his sobbing granddaughter-in-law or his utterly humiliated grandson, Judge Harrison Sterling descended the marble steps. He walked straight down the center aisle, parting the sea of stunned, silent guests. The crowd physically backed away from him, giving him a wide berth as he marched out of the cathedral. His spine was perfectly straight, leaving the complete wreckage of his own bloodline behind him, without a single ounce of regret or hesitation. I stood at the altar, feeling the solid, comforting warmth of Jamal's hand enveloping mine. His grip was steady, anchoring me to the present moment. I looked past the weeping, pathetic mess of my sister kneeling on the floor. I looked straight down the long aisle, past the rows of whispering socialites, right to the heavy wooden doors at the back of the church. My parents were standing there, completely frozen in place. Valerie's face was streaked with ruined mascara, her hands covering her mouth in absolute shock. Marcus looked pale, breathless, and utterly defeated. They were staring at me, their eyes wide with the horrifying realization that the daughter they had thrown away was the one holding the match that had ignited their entire world. They thought the worst was over. They thought losing Bradley's elite status and facing the public humiliation of Chloe's breakdown was the ultimate punishment they would have to endure today. I squeezed Jamal's hand, a slow, cold smile spreading across my lips. I watched my father pull his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the blank screen, desperately trying to comprehend how his carefully constructed empire was collapsing around him. He had no idea that my true strike had only just begun. The heavy thud of my father's knees hitting the polished hardwood floor echoed through the dead, silent ballroom. Marcus Jackson, the formidable patriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist and a conditional heart, was entirely broken. He stared blindly at the leather-bound folder I had just tossed onto the table, his breath coming in short, erratic gasps. The cross-collateralized loans were a financial death sentence, and he knew it. He had gambled his entire medical network to cover Bradley's massive fraudulent debts, absolutely certain that the Sterling family name would act as a magical shield. He had wagered my dignity and my future to protect a criminal, and he had lost everything. The hundreds of elite guests surrounding us, the chief medical officers, the high society matriarchs, the pastors who had dined at my parents' table stood in stunned, breathless silence. No one moved. No one raised a glass. They simply watched as the untouchable Jackson empire collapsed under the sheer weight of its own arrogance. Then the frantic rustle of silk broke the quiet. Valerie lunged forward. My mother practically threw herself across the space separating us. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her expensive mascara running in dark, jagged rivers down her cheeks. She collapsed beside my father, her hands frantically grasping at the silk fabric of my custom wedding gown. She clung to my leg, her knuckles white, her face tilted up toward me in an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. "Nia, please," Valerie sobbed, her voice a ragged, hysterical wail that made the surrounding guests physically recoil. "Please spare us. Spare your father. We were wrong. We made a terrible mistake. But you cannot do this to us. We are a family. We are your own flesh and blood. You have to forgive us. Blood is thicker than anything, Nia. Please." I stood perfectly still. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a second-class citizen in my own home. The crystal chandeliers above us cast a brilliant, blinding light over the scene, illuminating the stark contrast between us. I stood tall, wrapped in bridal white, anchored by the steady, unyielding presence of my husband standing right behind me. Below me, the two people who were supposed to protect me were groveling on the floor, stripped of their power, their wealth, and their pride. If I were observing this from the outside, it would look like a Renaissance painting. The camera of my mind circled the three of us in a slow, continuous loop, capturing every angle of their humiliation and my absolute unwavering calm. I looked into my mother's desperate, pleading eyes. The words she was using, family, blood, forgiveness, were the exact same weapons she had weaponized against me for 30 years to demand my silent submission. "Blood does not give you the right to sell me out to protect a fraud," I stated. My voice was not loud, but the acoustics of the room carried every single syllable to the farthest corners of the banquet hall. "Blood does not give you permission to sabotage my wedding day, to mock my husband, or to steal my financial security, just to maintain your fragile social status. You did not think about our blood when you liquidated my floral budget this morning. You did not think about family when you tried to make me walk down the aisle to a silent, empty cathedral. You only care about blood now because you are bleeding out." I gently but firmly stepped back, pulling my silk skirt from her desperate grip. Valerie let out a pathetic gasp, her empty hands falling to the floor. I snapped my fingers once. Jamal stepped forward, his expression completely unreadable, a masterclass in quiet, lethal power. He did not say a word. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a second, thicker stack of legal documents. He handed them to me with a brief, affirming nod. I held the heavy stack of paper in my hand, feeling the weight of the justice we had meticulously engineered over the past 6 months. I tossed the new contract onto the floor right between Marcus and Valerie. The thick paper slapped against the hardwood with a terrifying finality. "I am giving you exactly 30 days. I announced, my tone stripped of all emotion, sounding like a judge delivering a final verdict. Marcus dragged his eyes away from the floor and looked up at me, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. 30 days for what, he whispered, his voice cracking barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. 30 days to vacate the Buckhead mansion, I commanded. Valerie let out a sharp, horrified scream, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Chloe, who was leaning against a nearby pillar, looking like a shattered porcelain doll, let out a loud, shuddering gasp. The mansion was the crown jewel of my mother's social identity. It was the venue for her lavish parties, the physical proof of her superiority. And it was gone. You leveraged the house to secure the secondary loans for Bradley's shell companies, I explained, spelling out the financial suicide they had committed. When Bradley's accounts were frozen by his grandfather this afternoon, those secondary loans immediately defaulted. Jamal and I purchased that specific debt portfolio 3 weeks ago through an anonymous holding company. We own the mortgage, we own the deed. You are currently trespassing on my property, so you have 30 days to pack your designer clothes, take your expensive furniture, and get out. Marcus closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his weathered cheek. He looked like he had aged 20 years in the span of 5 minutes. And the clinic, my father asked, his voice completely hollow, realizing that he had absolutely no leverage left to negotiate. 30 days to execute a total transition of power, I confirmed ruthlessly. You will hand over the key, the operational codes, and the board seats to my corporate management team. You will sign the non-disclosure agreements, and you will step down as the chief medical director. If you try to fight me in court, I will publicly release the financial audit detailing exactly how you embezzled hospital funds to cover your son-in-law's gambling debts. I will ensure you lose your medical license on top of your fortune. You will walk away quietly, Marcus, or you will not walk away at all. My father slowly lowered his head until his chin rested against his chest. He did not argue. He did not threaten me. He simply surrendered to the absolute crushing reality of his defeat. Valerie was rocking back and forth on her knees, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. The high society friends she had spent decades trying to impress were actively turning their backs on her. I watched the elite women of the Jack and Jill Society, whispering behind their hands, shaking their heads in disgust. The chief surgeons from Marcus's hospital were already stepping away, physically distancing themselves from the toxic fallout of the Jackson family collapse. The social excommunication was instantaneous and permanent. I turned my gaze away from my broken parents and looked across the room. Bradley was standing near the exit doors, trying to blend into the shadows. He looked like a cornered rat, his eyes darting frantically toward the lobby, clearly calculating how fast he could run before anyone noticed. He had spent the entire evening watching his grandfather publicly disown him and watching me systematically dismantle the family that had foolishly protected him. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Bradley flinched instinctively, taking a step backward, his back hitting the heavy wooden doors. "Do not think I have forgotten about you, Bradley," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the room, pinning him in place. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "Nia, listen," he stammered, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "The money I took from your mortgage fund, it was just a temporary bridge loan, I swear. I was going to pay you and Jamal back with interest once the real estate deal closed. I was never going to leave you stranded. You have to believe me." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You really think I care about your pathetic excuses?" I asked, shaking my head in mild disgust. "You thought Jamal was just some foolish kid you could easily scam. You thought because you wore a custom suit and belonged to a legacy family, you were the smartest man in the room. But you never even realized that Jamal has been inside your personal servers for the last 6 months." Bradley's eyes widened in sheer panic. He looked at Jamal, who was standing beside me, with a cold, predatory smile. "Every single wire transfer, every offshore account, every fake shell company you created to launder money out of my father's clinic, Jamal tracked all of it," I revealed, watching the remaining color drain from Bradley's face. "You are not going to pay me back with interest, Bradley. You are going to pay me back by standing trial." "What are you talking about?" Bradley gasped, his voice pitching high with terror. "Jamal compiled a comprehensive digital ledger of your entire fraudulent enterprise," I stated, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "And 45 minutes ago, while your grandfather was giving his lovely speech at the cathedral, Jamal forwarded that entire encrypted file directly to the regional director of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division." Bradley opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked absolutely paralyzed, a man realizing he was completely out of options, out of money, and out of time. Right on cue, the faint, high-pitched wail of sirens began to bleed through the thick glass windows of the banquet hall. The sound grew louder, multiplying, echoing through the downtown streets as multiple vehicles rapidly approached the hotel. Red and blue lights began to flash against the sheer curtains, casting an eerie, frantic glow over the terrified faces of my family. "The police are here," I whispered, staring directly into Bradley's horrified eyes. "Run if you want to. It will only make the charges worse." I did not run. He could not. Two federal agents pushed through the heavy oak doors of the banquet hall before he could even take a breath. They read Bradley his rights right there on the polished dance floor, securing his wrists in steel handcuffs, while the remaining guests watched in stunned, breathless silence. The sharp metallic click of the cuffs was the final punctuation mark on his fabricated life of luxury. Chloe watched her husband being hauled away, her screams echoing through the lobby until her voice gave out entirely. Her descent was brutal and absolute. Stripped of the sterling name and protection, she was left drowning under the crushing weight of Bradley's hidden liabilities. When the scandal hit the local news networks the following morning, the prestigious hospital where she worked immediately placed her on indefinite unpaid leave. The proud, untouchable golden child was suddenly a public relations nightmare, buried in debt and completely unemployable. My parents fared no better. True to my word, the 30-day eviction notice was executed with ruthless efficiency. Marcus and Valerie were forced to pack whatever meager possessions the federal asset freeze allowed them to keep. They surrendered the keys to the Buckhead mansion and the deed to the surgical clinic. The Jack and Jill Society, the Country Club Board, and the Symphony Committee formally revoked their memberships within the week. Atlanta High Society slammed its doors shut, excommunicating them permanently. With no assets, no clinic, and no income, they were forced into a cramped, cheap rental apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city, miles away from the elite world they had sacrificed their own daughter to belong to. In their desperation, they tried to reach me. My phone logged dozens of blocked calls and pathetic rambling voicemails, begging for mercy, for a loan, for just one more chance to be a family. I never answered. I simply deleted the logs. I transferred the total operational control of Marcus's former clinic to a trusted team of executives from my med spa empire. In a matter of days, the Jackson name was entirely scrubbed from the building, replaced by a fresh modern logo that belonged exclusively to me. Now, months later, I stand in the quiet, sunlit living room of the home Jamal and I built together. I walk slowly across the plush rug, tracing my fingers over the silver frames of our wedding photos resting on the mantel. In the pictures, I am radiant, flanked by my brilliant husband and a titan of a judge who recognized my worth when my own blood did not. I smile, savoring the absolute peace of my new reality. My parents thought that stripping away the man supposed to walk me down the aisle meant stripping away my dignity. They wanted to see me broken, abandoned, and begging on my knees. They did not know that leaving me to walk alone only left my hands completely free to open my own doors. The wedding celebration that followed later that evening was nothing short of spectacular. It was a true celebration of survival and rebirth. Instead of the tense, artificial high society masquerade, my mother had meticulously planned the reception, transformed into an intimate, joyous gathering of real love. Judge Harrison Sterling stayed for the entire evening, raising a glass of vintage champagne to toast our union, publicly blessing our marriage with the full weight of his unyielding respect. Jamal's family surrounded me with a warmth and acceptance I had never experienced in my own home. My true friends, the ones who knew my struggles and celebrated my victories, danced until midnight. There were no hushed whispers, no judgmental stares, and absolutely no toxic shadows lingering in the corners. We were surrounded entirely by people who cherished us. Jamal and I took the ashes of my past and used them to forge a completely different kind of legacy. Using the profits salvaged from the restructuring of my father's former medical network, we established a philanthropic foundation. Today we actively fund and mentor women of color who are launching their own businesses. We provide the financial backing and strategic guidance that I was once brutally denied. I spend my days empowering women who have been underestimated, overlooked, and discarded by their own communities. I teach them how to leverage their unique brilliance and how to strike back against a world that demands their submission. I lift my porcelain teacup from the mantel, taking a slow, comforting sip of warm tea. The morning light spills through the floor-to-ceiling windows, washing my living room in a brilliant golden glow. I look out over the sprawling, magnificent skyline of Atlanta, watching the city wake up. The view is clear, bright, and utterly limitless. A profound sense of fulfillment washes over me. The hardest lesson I had to learn is that family is not defined by shared blood or a common last name. Family is defined by the people who stand fiercely beside you and protect you when your back is turned. Family is the sanctuary that nurtures your growth, not the prison that demands your shrinkage. You must never make yourself small just to fit into a cage that someone else built for you, even if that cage is plated in gold. I turn away from the window and look directly at you. Have you ever had to walk through a brutal storm entirely on your own, only to realize that the people you loved the most were the ones conjuring the rain? Have you ever had to burn down the table just to prove you deserved a seat? Share your story in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel because, as we both know, the absolute truth is always the sweetest revenge.